constitutional theorist and a scholar. He holds a very important chair at UT Austin, and he has taught in New York University, Harvard, Princeton, Boston University, UCLA, and the University of Michigan. He's author and co-author of a dozen articles, many now classics in the canon of legal scholarship. Professor Seeger is the author of 2 books, Justice and Plain Clothes, and Religious Freedom and the Constitution. So, Professor Seeger, if you want.
Thank you very much. I want to begin by congratulating Jim Fleming on getting as far as he has with this manuscript. It's a kind of an extraordinary undertaking to look at the entire waterfront of sophisticated constitutional theory and try to understand it and connect it to what you think is the best understanding of such theory. It's extraordinary. I say in the sort of just casual note that begins my comments, I'm really in awe that he could engage so many people with such patience and with such fairness. I think it's a very impressive effort. And a lot of my sympathies are with Jim, and I say here this is in the nature of a concurring opinion, and it is. It's also in the nature of a very early set of responses to the manuscript, and perhaps less systematic than some of the other commentators. I also want to thank Emer for this occasion and for other occasions. He's a wonderful and sophisticated intellectual entrepreneur, and it's great for all of us, and thank you so much. So I have essentially 4 comments. Yes, thank you. I'm sorry that I think we all owe a real debt to Emer, and I'm just one of the last of the day to mention it. It is the end of the day, and I know enough to know that no sensible person stands between people and their dinner longer than necessary. So I'll move along as briskly as I can. I have 4 comments that actually thread together, I think, but I'm more interested in making the 4 comments than emphasizing the thread that ties them, and so that's how I'll proceed. The first comment concerns the purpose of our constitutional practice. Now, more important than what I will identify as the purpose of our constitutional practice is the importance of the question to this conversation. And the importance is this. I think it is emphatically the case that the role of the text in our constitutional practice is in effect for the constitutional practice to decide. The practice is not in service of the text. The text is in service of the practice. And the role it plays in that practice needs to be defended from the vantage point of what makes this the most satisfactory practice for us as a democratic constitutional people. Now, that doesn't predetermine what the role of the text is, and I think I know of no theorist who completely would discard the text or actually come close to discarding it. Even David Strauss, when the language that Larry quotes indicates he's hanging by his fingernails. But what needs to be done is a careful description of why, in the best view of our constitutional practice, the text has a certain role. And as I say, I think that's interesting and surprising. I don't try to make the case out, but I indicate one thing that is not often mentioned, just as an example, and that is, if you believe, as most will, that the constituent sovereign, the people, have to have a way of reining in the constitutional practice in some times and places, then you have to have the control of the text over other constitutional actors. So some importance to the text is wrought in, but it needs to be defended. I feel, perhaps unfairly, because I've only read bits and pieces of Larry's work, including his article here, I feel that sophisticated originalists like Larry think that you can start with the text and a set of sophisticated propositions about the meaning of written language and work out to a constitutional practice. I think by the time you get to what Larry calls the construction zone, it's a little late. The question is from the outset, what role should the text play? And what in turn does that say about our relationship to the text? I give an answer to what the purpose of our constitutional practice is, and it is that it is justice-seeking. That is to say that it fundamentally seeks to align us better as a people with fundamental principles of justice than we would otherwise be. I actually have a curious footnote that I'll drop to that purpose about constitutional justice and indeed about many theories of political justice, which is just I can't resist the annotation. And that is, I think the justice of the Constitution and many theories of justice is not an aspiration to perfect justice. It's an aspiration to avoid singular injustices. I think constitutional justice is basically about avoiding prominent injustices, and I think that's true of a lot of political justice. But that's still a lofty ambition, because our governance as a people and our legal structure has significant injustices that we are still dealing with. See Lyndon McLean's admirable discussion of same-sex marriage. That's an example of how we make ourselves more just by eliminating a really prominent injustice. So I think our Constitution is justice-seeking. I don't understand my use of the term justice-seeking to have really different denotation or connotation than the way Jim and Sott use aspirational. It may be that these are just different terms for the same thing, and I'm not sure that I have a reason for my preference except that it's where I landed with it, and I don't mean more to say about that. Okay, so that's my first proposition, that our constitutional practice is justice-seeking, and the question of the role of the text in that practice needs to be considered from the vantage of that purpose, and that's the way into arguments about the appropriate relationship between constitutional responsible decision makers and the text. What relationship best serves the justice-seeking nature of our constitutional practice? Now, let me make clear that it doesn't mean to assume that, for example, the democratic nature of the practice or other features are all part of what makes a constitution justice-seeking. It's not like you get to choose any mechanism and ignore its own connection to justice. It isn't just an outcome-determined view of what is a good justice-seeking constitution. Okay. Second thing I take up in this paper, which begins as a response to Larry Solomon, but actually I think is meant to end up with Jim and his position about a variety of the theorists he looks at, is the following. Everyone agrees that there are provisions in the Constitution, possibly many provisions of the Constitution, that are not, to use my term, and I'll explain my eccentric terminology, encompassing. And what I mean by an encompassing provision of the Constitution is that a constitutional provision that contains or can be read to direct a full description of the state of affairs to which the provision aspires. So a non-encompassing provision is something that Larry would call underdeterminate. And the only reason that I resist the underdeterminate is it is of a piece with his topology and of a piece with not just a sense, but I think more than that, a judgment that in some sense a non-encompassing constitutional provision is a failed constitutional provision. If things had gone well, the framers would have had encompassing provisions of the Constitution, and we wouldn't be worried about what he would call the construction zone. I think that's not the case, And indeed, I think something turns on that. So Larry's topology of non-encompassing provisions is relevant here. It is as follows, and like much of what I'm coming to appreciate of his writing, it contains a degree of analytical precision, which is unusual and attractive, but I think it's misleading. Here's the topology of non-encompassing provisions. A non-encompassing provision may be vague, which means that there are boundary issues at its margins. There are going to be controversial margins of its reach. It may be ambiguous, meaning it's susceptible to more than one meaning. It may be contradictory, in direct conflict with another provision, or it may leave important gaps. And as Larry indicated in his presentation here, he's agnostic as to whether there are contradictory and gaps. So the main categories are going to be vague and ambiguous. Now, here are two important things about this topology, getting to the point that I wish to make. The first is, any way you look at it, these terms are not flattering, right? Vague, ambiguous, contradictory, and riven with gaps. I mean, this reads like the deadly failings of expression, right? Who would want to be called any one of those things? Who would want to leave behind text that was any of those things? Now, I think that that's important because the second thing I want to observe is I think in a significant respect there is a fifth category of non-encompassing constitutional provision, and that fifth category is quite important to our discussions in general, and finally to where Jim and the authors he examines confront each other. And I want to call that delegatory. And the claim I want to make is that there are provisions of the Constitution, the most interesting and important provisions of the Constitution, which are appropriately read as delegations of authority and responsibility to fill in abstract concepts with working conceptions and ultimately legal rules. The example I give of what I mean by delegatory, I borrow from Dworkin. I'm pretty sure I remember how Dworkin used this, and it was to a very different end. So Dworkin gave the example of a soldier whose commanding officer comes up to him or her and says, I need the 6 most able members of your squadron for this mission. And the point is, that's a delegation. And that's an instruction, not a vague instruction, not an ambiguous instruction, not a gap-ridden instruction. I want to make that very clear in this ordinary speech context. Certainly not contradictory. It's a complete statement of the form, find the 6 most able members of your squadron for this mission. It's a completed statement of a familiar kind that has an affirmative and not the negative connotation of these vices. Now, the proposition I want to make is that that's how we should understand some, perhaps many, important provisions of the Constitution at stake here, as delegations to constitutionally responsible actors who confront them to fill them in with content. And I want to suggest that not only should they be understood that way, but they impose, read from the text, they impose an obligation on the delegee, the range of potential delegees, an obligation of the form. When I go back then to the Dworkin example, I imagine a pretty terse writing from the higher ranked officer saying, here's this very important mission, we need the 6 best members of your company to execute the mission. Reads pretty much like a directive, get them, and pretty much like that person has an obligation. I want to insist that things like the Free Exercise Clause or the Free Expression Clause of the First Amendment have exactly that form, that they are appropriately understood as pointing to what I would call a conception, not getting drawn into galley and contestable thoughts, but a conception because they point with some obviousness to an important moral virtue, free expression or free exercise, which I think should be read as religious liberty or something generic like that. That would, by the public meaning method, if one were drawn to it, that they are delegations and that they impose a responsibility and that they're not in this list. Larry actually, in passing, mentions delegations, but it's in a very different context. It relates to gaps. And he says something, maybe elsewhere he talks about them, he says something about there being the need for an explicit delegation, essentially to a known delegee. I don't understand why that is part of public meaning. Quite the reverse. It seems a distortion of public meaning to say, don't read it the way it reads, but add this additional interpretive burden of a kind of a clear statement rule and a known delegee. It's just not public meaning material. It's something different. Now, maybe it could be defended, but it would be defended from outside original meaning. And that's the final thing I want to say about this. This particular piece of things is this. I don't think it follows from the delegatory reading of some important generalities in the Constitution that the moral reading of the Constitution must proceed. I think it's possible that for reasons not connected with public meaning, constitutional theorists, otherwise given to sort of respond to the public meaning, especially moral reading constitutional theorists, could say, we can't do that. You know, there are reasons, there are democratic reasons, we don't trust the courts, there are Thayerian reasons why we should defer to other bodies. You know, we don't want a robust judicial moral reading of the Constitution. But they would not be originalist meanings. And a moral reading person coming on these provisions would respond to them sort of as they are, unless he or she saw these external, non-original reasons coming from the moral reading of the Constitution itself to withhold robust judicial enforcement. I don't think those reasons exist, but I'm just noting that. Similarly, and this is when we get very much to where Jim is with his originalist lineup. Similarly, I think the delegatory reading of the Constitution's generality means that many originalists should find themselves involved in a process that looks a great deal like the moral reading of the Constitution, because as original meaning people reading these provisions, they will see an obligatory delegation to fill in the abstract conceptions like free expression and religious liberty with content. That's what they are directed to do. Now, they too might decline that, but they would not decline it because of their original meaning commitments. They too would have to step outside the text and find extra textual reasons for not engaging in what the Constitution seems to direct responsible constitutional actors to engage in. So that's the claim about this fifth non-encompassing provision. I think that they are delegatory provisions, and that so understood, they make a lot of headway in the direction of some of the positions that Jim wants to take in these contexts. That's my second observation. My third observation, which may take me in some ways more in the camp of David Strauss and other constructivists, I suppose, but I get there in a slightly different way. I think going back to my first observation, which is that it's from the vantage of a well-functioning constitutional practice, realizing its justice-seeking role to the best extent possible, that's how we should be considering the relationship of courts and other actors to text. I think it's critical that we have a view about courts and whether they work well and why they work well, or if not well, whether they are comparatively trustworthy or comparatively attractive decision makers. Because an inevitable consequence of our theory about the relationship of courts, for example, and texts is going to be more or less responsibility on the part of courts to make judgments about difficult and controversial constitutional content. So it's hard to think that we can be sort of institution neutral and have a view about these matters. This is part of my view that you can't start with the existence of a writing and communication theory. You have to ask about the process, and that means asking something about courts. I happen to think that courts are relatively good decision makers in complicated and controversial normative contexts like giving content, more precise content to the Constitution. And I want to make that case for two reasons, albeit briefly. How much time do I have, by the way? Am I doing okay? I think I am.
You are doing okay. Yes.
Okay. First, because since I think we have reasons to hold courts in comparatively high regard, even though this is not an easy moment to support that with enthusiasm, I think it argues for a view of our constitutional practice which cedes courts authority and responsibility rather than one which withholds it. Secondly, because of what I think are the virtues of the judicial process, it may have some implications for other elements of the theory, and I suggest at the end of all this that it's possible, but only possible, that Jim and I disagree at the margins about how important precedent is. Because on my account, precedent is some version of the gravitational pull of precedent is important to what makes courts special. Okay, so let me set the theory out. I say in here that it is a cartoon, and it is indeed a cartoon. I wish I had the advantage of someone who could say, I've got 3 volumes coming out that will handle all this. I don't think I can say that, actually. But I have written about this in somewhat greater length and hopefully more persuasively than I'll deal with it here today. And that is, common law courts, and our constitutional courts are indeed common law courts, have 2 very interesting characteristics. They are reason-giving, and they are, what do I say here? I don't say precedent following, but precedent, they feel the tug of precedent, and I wanted to capture that right. Precedent drawn. They are reason-giving and precedent drawn, which is exactly what I want to say about them. Because I don't believe that they should or could follow precedent absolutely. I think they have theories of mistake. They overrule cases, often triumphantly, but they are drawn to precedent. Dworkin's gravitational pull is, for me, an attractive metaphor. Now, that means that when courts decide cases, they engage in a kind of institutional reflective equilibration. And I won't go into reflective equilibrium in detail, although I'm glad to in questions. The constructivist account really embodies some such view, and the vocabulary is not important. But the rough idea is this, that when a court, I'll give the court version, not the idealized version of reflective equilibration. The court version is this: when a judge decides a case, she has to give reasons. And those reasons have to connect her to the attractive parts of her past, her court's past, and they have to chart a course that is attractive among future cases that will come to her. So she has to line up her reason or reasons in the case before her with the best version of her past and future. And I give a simple example. I used to talk about Skokie. I realized that we had this really scary example. I give the example of the American Nazi Party, and I need to whisper this. I don't want to inspire them. That wants to hold a parade in Ferguson, Missouri, and they want to march in Nazi regalia, and they want to spill their vile hatred that is racial and ethnic and religious. They actually did try to march for a long time in Skokie, Illinois. If anything, it's even more catastrophic to think of them marching in Ferguson. So I'm imagining that Ferguson says, "Are you kidding?" and denies their parade permit, and that the case works its way up to a justice of the Supreme Court. And I'm thinking of her solipsistically for the moment, not a member of a nine-justice court. She isn't free to ask in some freestanding way, should the American Nazi Party march in Ferguson? She has to think about Selma, Alabama, and Martin Luther King and the civil rights cases. And she has to think about military protesters outside Fort Hood, Texas, in time of war. And she has to ask, what is an attractive and an appropriate proposition that will decide this case? Now, let me say, I'm not insisting that these cases are indistinguishable, although I tend to come out on the free speech side of all this. I'm suggesting she has to either line them up or give valid distinctions that are binding. So that's what's special about common law courts, being caught in this state of institutional reflective equilibration. And I suggest that there are three things that are good about that. And I'll say them quickly to keep an eye on time, although I think I'm doing okay. One, she has to enjoy a certain kind, she has to act on a certain kind of fairness that might otherwise be hard for all of us to act. She, in some ways, has to ignore who's on the other side of the V, because in a certain way, the despised American Nazi Party is saying to her, we stand in the shoes of Martin Luther King in Selma, and we stand in the shoes of war protesters outside Fort Hood. So she has to treat the American Nazi Party in a particularly fair way as a consequence of this structure. Two, among methods of practical reasoning about complicated normative matters, there are few, if any, that are better than reflective equilibration. So I think a responsible common law court has judgmental capacities that other institutions do not. And three, and this is in a way, to me, the most interesting, I'll do the least justice to it, and it may be the most controversial. I think common law courts function in a way that is procedurally a democratic virtue that is very hard to find anywhere else in the portfolio of governmental institutions. And the claim is this. Well, the example I give is a person educated in the schools of Yemen through, I think, the 5th grade, who is an accused and strongly suspected terrorist, can become a constitutional claimant and prevail in the Supreme Court of the United States against the Secretary of Defense, and in a time when the country sort of thinks it's halfway in a state of war with terrorism. That notion that it doesn't matter how many dollars you have, it doesn't matter how many votes you have, but what you have to offer is an argument that your situation connects in principle to the jurisprudence of the court on an ongoing basis. That, I insist, is a democratic virtue. It's not electoral equality, it is deliberative equality. So those are the three things that I think make courts reasonably attractive institutions to decide important normative questions like matters of constitutional substance. And, as I said in anticipation, but I certainly don't want to stress this, Jim explained the context in which he was saying this to me. Jim at one point appears to slightly depreciate the weight of precedent, and I'm suggesting it's not an absolute weight, but in a certain way to be a moral reader of our constitutional tradition is to think that it is attractive and important that courts play this robust role, and that is to think that precedent has to at least have an honest chance in the way that I think it does in our common law system. Okay.
Many thanks.
I have one last thing to say, but it's very brief.
Sorry.
No, not at all. I paused too long. And that is this question of fidelity. I agree. I actually found much of what Dick Fallon said persuasive. But I had already said in my closing paragraph that I have concern either about the use of the word fidelity or at least careful use of the word fidelity. And my concerns, I thought Dick's notion about fidelity versus infidel were fascinating, and a general aversion to religious. My concern about fidelity is somewhat different and really was in my craw as early as Jim's very interesting Fordham symposium on fidelity. I was uncomfortable with that being our theme then. And I think it's about this. I think about fidelity as faithfulness, and faithfulness about implying, at least without more, a kind of deep commitment to the past. To be faithful to something is to cling to it over time. And so I think about fidelity as sort of pointing to the past without an understanding of defense of it. And in particular, in this brief paragraph, I thought Jim's actual title, Fidelity to Our Imperfect Constitution, while very catchy and ironic, seems wrong-headed, right? You don't want us to be faithful to engage in fidelity to our imperfect Constitution. You want us to be faithful or to engage in fidelity to a process of improving ourselves with regard to that Constitution. So fidelity to our imperfect Constitution seems wrong, and constitutional fidelity has some of that built in. So this is what I said we should have fidelity to. It doesn't give you a title, and that is, I said, what is it in our constitutional practice that is worthy of fidelity? And this is my suggestion. Our constitutional practice represents a sustained effort to be the best version of ourselves as a people. That is an aspiration worthy of all the fidelity of all constitutional actors, judges, scholars, legislators, and members of our political community in their political capacity as voters. And that's what we should be faithful to, the practice that aims at making us the best version of ourselves. How to capture that in a phrase, I'm not sure, but I'm happy with fidelity if we understand that to be its target. I want to end where I began by saying I think this is an awe-inspiring effort of great value to me and to a lot of other folks, and this was in the nature of a concurring opinion, and I'm really grateful to be here and to deliver it in person. Thank you, and thanks again, Immer.
Well, Larry, thank you so much. Let me repeat what I said at the beginning of the day. I'm honored to have you as one of the two leading Dworkinians in American constitutional theory here, and those words mean a lot to me, and I appreciate the support. And also, I want to say, I think that your point about the purpose of our constitutional practice is extremely powerful, and I didn't frame it explicitly in those terms, but I do think a similar understanding is implicit in the way in the book. I also think that your formulation about delegatory constitutional provisions, although I wouldn't have used that formulation, I think it helps capture a big difference between the way you and I think about the Constitution's abstract commitments and the way I now understand more clearly the way Larry might think about them. And I now maybe understand why Larry thought I misunderstood him in my interpretation of his book when I thought that in conceding that the Constitution embodied general standards, he was making concessions to folks like us. That if instead the general standards he envisions have all of these failings, rather than actually being one of the virtues of those commitments as abstract commitments, I think I now maybe understand more clearly why he thinks I misunderstood him. I also think that we may be in about the same place on precedent. I was concerned to avoid any implication that in taking fit with legal materials, including precedents, that meant an obligation to follow the past as such. Because I didn't think that could be a coherent obligation, because I do think that the precedents are often a very mixed bag, and I think you have to work up an understanding of you've got to do, as it were, a moral reading on where the precedents are going and how they best cohere. So I don't think we're that far away from each other on that. And I think when it comes to the, I think in your case, a mild aversion to fidelity, I think that, like David Strauss and like Dick, people who have these deep, very rich understandings of our practice as a common law practice, in the end may see the practice as so forward-looking that you have an understandable aversion to thinking about fidelity as being an overarching commitment. But I don't think of fidelity as involving or as entailing any kind of commitment to unquestioned loyalty. I think that fidelity is, I think you put it very well at the end. I think that it is a sustained effort to attain our best selves as a people and as a practice. I want to explain the title a little bit more fully. As you know, proponents of moral readings and justice-seeking constitutionalisms get charged with the view that our Constitution is perfect, that it embodies our perfect vision of the perfect liberal Constitution. And so I try to deflect that objection by conceding all manner of imperfections in our constitutional order, all kinds of moral shortfalls, and your very fine account of the thinness and the moral shortfall of our constitutional practice, I help myself to in trying to explain how I think a moral reading should respond to the perfect Constitution challenge. Okay, so I think we're exactly on the same page on that. But also, I do think that I'm not like a leftist or outsider critic who wants to say, well, there are all these imperfections, so let's do away with the Constitution, to use Mike Slavin's formulation, or to do, say, a critical legal studies debunking of the Constitution. My view is that if we're in this practice, and if it's at least tolerably just to make it worth striving to fulfill its promise, I think we should strive to maintain an attitude of fidelity to that practice and to work out the best understandings of our constitutional commitments. So I think in the end, I may not have the same aversion to fidelity because I don't see it as necessarily backward-looking, and I do see the imperfect Constitution part as something that's very necessary to make the whole moral reading, to make it credible as an account of our constitutional practice rather than some kind of liberal attempt to rewrite the Constitution in the image of a perfect liberal Constitution, as people like Henry Monahan have charged. So that explains the, or that is what animates the title. Okay. Very
Gotcha.
Questions? So should you? Can I?
Let me preface my question by saying I have no idea what I'm talking about. You know, and I'm serious about that. I was trying to process this and taking notes, and I wound up going nowhere with what I was trying to say. Let me see if I can get at it this way. I'm sort of wondering what ultimately the justification is for this idea that constitutional provisions are delegatory in character. And let me try to get at it this way. All right, there's a big difference between criminal law and look, I don't want anybody to think I know anything about specific legal rules and stuff. I went to law school, but I'm a philosopher. I don't have a comprehensive grasp of all this. But there's a difference between civil law and criminal law. Criminal law, you have to, what reasonable notice requires or how they're conceived as functioning, you've got to be really, really precise with respect to language. Why? Because of the importance of the interests involved. Incarceration, and in the USA, we still got the death penalty and possibly death. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to common law, the civil law stuff, a whole lot of generality and vagueness is permitted. Why? If you look at the foundational rule of negligence, for example, that's couched in very, very general language it's a non-encompassing rule, clearly. So one, I don't think I have any problem with the idea that non-encompassing rules are necessarily a bad thing. But here's the problem. The reason that that people will tolerate more vagueness with respect to the rules in civil laws because the interests are nowhere near as important. Civil law just mostly moves money around. And don't get me wrong, I love money, but not as much as I love liberty and my life. Now, here's the problem. I think, I don't know whether this is a problem for you or not, but constitutional norms implicate exactly this, the most important interests we have. Much more important than just moving money around like civil law, much closer to the criminal law in terms of the interests they're protecting. Now, a delegatory conception with respect to the civil law makes perfect sense. In fact, I think that's sort of an explicit intention. Wouldn't make sense in the case of criminal law because of the importance of the interests involved. So I'm kind of wondering why, given the importance of the interests protected by the Constitution, how do you get out of this, from a moral point of view, this idea that these rules are delegatory in character?
Well, there's a sense in which I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me.
I probably don't either. That's why I said I don't know what I'm talking about.
I could formulate in several different ways, but I'd rather just say some things and see if it answers it. So let's look at a provision. So, how does the First Amendment read? Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech? No, freedom of expression? Yeah, no, but then it gets to, or freedom of speech and press, right? It says that, okay. Now, what are the possibilities for someone who is committed to public meaning of that provision? One possibility is the argument that for reasons that we don't know, sort of terms of art or something else, but hard to take out of communicative meaning, one argument is this has encompassing meaning. Now, the only serious judge or scholar in a long time that has said that phrase has determinate meaning was Justice Black. And most people ridicule Justice Black for that. You look at that provision, and it seems to say, it seems to point at an idea, a conception of liberty, which is free speech. So what are your choices at that point? One is to say, you could take a Thayerian position and say it's hopelessly vague. It doesn't say much, and therefore, whatever government does, we will treat as being consistent with this because it doesn't have purchase on governmental conduct at this level of generality. That hardly seems to serve the interest you're concerned with about the things that are most important to people. So what are the other options? The other option is to say one way to make perfectly good sense of the framers expressing themselves in this way and turning the job over to legislators and judges and citizens is they delegated responsibility for filling in that concept with workable conceptions, doctrine, and absolute and actual case judgments. So, I mean, it's not like you have the option of saying, let's make this utterly secure by assigning immediate meaning to it, because the meaning doesn't exist on the surface. Unless you say, of course the meaning is there, the meaning points to a general, recognizable virtue of democratic government, which is freedom of expression. But when asked about, well, what do you think about prior restraint? What do you think about hate speech? What do you think about virtually any kind of interesting and controversial case? You're going to have resources to fill that in to make it valuable in our political life at all. And I think treating this as a delegation of that responsibility is the best reading. It's the best reading contextually, because how else could the virtue be realized except by delegation? And it's the best reading in terms of, in a certain sense, plain meaning. I gave the example of, we need the 6 best individuals in your squadron. We need the best view of free speech. Who's going to get the best view of free speech? Who are you going to call? It's going to be the courts and the legislature and other governmental actors. Now, look, it might be that when we got right down to it and arm wrestled, we'd think some of these things were delegatory and some weren't. But what I want to insist, the kind of logical categories that were offered here, sort of technical categories, exclude one important logical category, and I think a very powerful claimant, which is delegatory. But it doesn't leave you worse off to have delegated this. It leaves you better off. Someone's responsible. It's not like you have the advantage of enforcing the right without having assigned more meaning to it.
Okay, you have it. Oh. Okay.
No, you.
No,
No, I was going to hand
Yes.
this one to you. Okay, hand this to you. That was what I was going to do.
Okay. Thank you, Larry. Those were really lovely and illuminating remarks. So on just a little point about the typology and the term underdeterminate. Yeah, so I get underdetermination from Quine, right? That was sort of the route. That seemed to me to be the appropriate word in the context in which I first used it, which was in debates about the radical indeterminacy thesis and critical legal studies in the 1980s. And then it just sort of, it's the word I use and it's carried forward. I don't mean this point about underdeterminacy. Legal texts are always, any complicated legal text is going to be underdeterminative of its legal effect. And I don't mean that to express a negative judgment. I certainly appreciate how the typology, which I think you got from originalism in constitutional construction, because it's not. I think it's out of the Fordham thing. So that's originalism in constitutional construction. Just for those of you who might be looking for it, it's not in the paper that I circulated here. And I certainly understand how that typology could have negative connotations. I didn't intend it to. And Also, that formulation of the typology is not intended to be an exhaustive list of the sources of underdetermination. And so, for instance, in the handout for today and in my remarks, I talk about open texture, incommensurable multi-criteria concepts. There's also concepts that are vague in multiple dimensions. I really don't feel like I finished working this out. However, you're on to something about me, because I am a rule of law guy. And so I do think that we want as much clarity as we can get, given the purposes we're trying to achieve. But I don't believe it would even be possible to eliminate the underdeterminacy. And there are clearly cases in which delegations are a good idea, and there are constitutional contexts where it seems to me they're necessary. And certainly, given the Fourth Amendment we've got, reasonable should not somehow be transformed into a completely determinate concept. That would be silly and would not achieve the purposes of the Fourth Amendment. And it's not faithful to the meaning of the word reasonable. Just one more thing, which is just the 6 most able members of the squadron, or the best. But your original formulation was most able.
I think I formulated about 8 ways.
Yeah. So that's delegatory in 2 different ways, right? So one way is that it gives someone a power or authority, right? And things can be delegatory in that sense, even if they don't call for the person to whom the power is delegated to do any working out, right? Because you can confer on someone a power to do something, right, that where your instruction as to what they should do is, as determinate as it could possibly be, and contains only, sort of micro indeterminacies. But this particular delegation uses the one in your original formulation, and it would also be true of best. The words able and best, right, are in ordinary usage not vague. That's correct, right? But they are multi-criteria concepts that include multiple dimensions, so that the exercise of judgment would be required, right? Who are the best members of your squad? Well, that's a very complicated question, and the 6 best, it might depend on who's in the top 3, who the rest are, because you want complementary skills and so on and so forth. Very complicated judgments would be required. Now, of course, if there was a well understood prior convention, there was the Army ability test, and the word ability in this context, able, meant highest scoring, then it would be a determinate direction. But in ordinary English, it's not. And so that's a source of underdetermination in the neutral sense I mean that term. And it's that makes it delegatory. Boy, that's a great word. I did a quick Westlaw search and looked on Google Books. So you're the first person, as far as I can tell, to use it in this sense in constitutional discourse. And I think it's
in some dictionary. I bet the OED has it.
The word
OED has everything.
The word delegatory is used and in law in various ways, but not in this context. And I think it's a lovely usage that I would like to take on board.
It's a deal. I gave Jim obdurate already. Let me respond to that. This was a draft, and it's a little playful, as with the reference to obdurate and wanting royalties from Jim. I didn't mean to be accusatory, especially about underdeterminate, which I was pretty sure was a precise term in a variety of schema. But I did want to emphasize by at least temporarily using my own vocabulary, top to bottom, encompassing, non-encompassing. I wanted to emphasize that in the very best arrangements, we might conclude that the best possible arrangement was non-encompassing. That's true, I think, about the 6 members of the 6 most able or 6 best members of the squadron. And I wanted to say, if I didn't make that clear in response to Ken's observation, it's probably the best thing we could do for free expression. Because if we had instead started, delineating, don't do this, don't do that, a little of this, a little of that, I think in the end you'd have less, not more protection. So, and there may be different reasons why that should be so. And the multi-criterial reason is interesting and useful, but there may be other reasons that I think we could cash out with regard, for example, to free expression, including and especially the fact that this is meant to be a constitution, a very durable constitution, and any thoughtful framer or constitutional strategist would say, we're not going to get this right. There are just too many different, we might not even have thought of hate speech yet, or we might not have thought about this. What we want is a deep commitment to the idea of free expression, and by God, work it out in contexts that press it. I think that's the best the framers could do, is what I really want to say. Even though it might or might not be multi-criterial, it's a different reason for the same outcome.
Yeah. First is just a footnote to the discussion of delegation, then my main point. I think in administrative law and in the philosophy of it, there's an elaborate discussion of all of these different ideas about ministerial, even in Marbury, right? Ministerial, non-ministerial, intelligible principle, and all of this kind of thing. It's probably been worked out fairly elaborately. I'm not saying it's not useful to think of it this way, but I actually think even Madison discussed it this way. I think it's very, this isn't a criticism. I think it's very helpful in this theory to maybe discuss it that way, but I don't think it's a new thing. I haven't done a Google search, but the concept is it. But that's not my main point. My main point is I had a question about the degree you relied on David Strauss, which I have to confess I haven't read, although I've read a lot about it, about common law, about the common law. And but part of what you said in discussing the common law, I guess you called it reflective equilibration, right? That process of giving the best reasons with the best version of our past and our future. That, at least in the form of the common law, and judging in particular according to a common law developmental tradition, that's a very professionalized discourse. I think of, and now maybe this is more a critique of Strauss's book, No,
it's a mistake to deflect any of this onto Strauss, as I'll explain. This is me.
Okay. So the way I see that, at least the way I see common law is continuous, incremental, professionalized. But when you talked about this, and I think rightly, you cited key historical events that, for example, within free speech, a lot of what a judge does as part of that process in our constitutional tradition is talk about the revolution, the meaning of the Civil War, the meaning of the New Deal, the meaning of World War II, what we learned in World War II, what we learned in fighting Hitler or the Civil Rights Movement. And I think that was really important. So I guess what I'm asking is how much of your thinking about that process as undertaken by judges in a constitutional system such as ours involves thinking about events, right? Big historical events and narrating big historical events rather than more doctrinal analysis of the principles of earlier precedent.
Well, on the first thing about administrative law, I think most people would say there's not much you can learn from American administrative law. I mean, the biggest principles of American, people have made their career by demonstrating that the most important cases aren't followed. in administrative law. I have no doubt that administrative theorists have talked a lot about rules and standards and delegations, and that thinking about all that is useful. If there's anything interesting, it's about thinking about the general clauses of the Constitution as, in this respect, in this sense, delegatory. That's the contribution, and that's what it's meant to be. It's not meant to be, I have some great ideas about delegation from delegatory. I'm sure there's delegation theory. The Fallon and Strauss thing, I just wanted to acknowledge them. I've talked this way about courts for a long time, and I suspect if I work it out, I have sympathies with Strauss and with Fallon and differences, but everything I say here is me, for better or for worse. The interesting thing is what you say about this doesn't look common law in the incremental tweaking sense. And actually, I want to distinguish between two uses of common law here. And this may just be a vocabulary problem on my part. One would be direct and close analogy to the actual workings of the common law over time in the Anglo-American tradition. That would be one possibility. Dworkin, by the way, brings these things together willy-nilly. But the second would be this. What I meant to say about a common law court was the very specific features that I described, which are true of common law courts in both settings. That is to say, they are reason-giving and precedent-drawn. And it was those features of courts that I want to stress, that as a general rule, or often, or always, I think probably not always, that looks differently as it plays out with regard to constitutional progress. I have no doubt about that. Although, bear in mind, a lot of constitutional progress can be pretty slow and incremental. Justice O'Connor breaks some ground in saying what are the rights of public officials, public employees to have free speech. And then the next case comes along, and it's public contractors. And it's now a fairly technical matter, right? And the technical matter is, should we give them that same body of things, and why or why not? And the court says, yes, public contractors get the same pale set of rights. That's pretty common law-y and some of constitutional law is going to look that way. By the way, I can't resist saying something that made me think that he might actually have a brain tumor, and I'm serious. Justice Thomas writes Justice Scalia writes a two-judge dissent to the simple thing of giving public contractors the same very thin rights that public employees have. And Scalia begins his dissent, and I can actually remember it by saying, this court is writing a constitution for a country that I do not recognize. And I actually thought some pathology had entered the story. I mean, it's one thing when we're talking about gay rights and the Kulturkampf, and the stakes seem to be, at least for Justice Scalia, high. The notion that this technical incremental change was writing, but anyway, so there are lots of moments in the Constitution that look sort of common law-y, but all I want to insist on is that reason-giving, precedent-following creates in courts a special kind of institution, and that it may be different in constitutional context is probably quite right, in interesting and useful ways, but not in ways that I think detract from the argument here.
This is just a small footnote. I'm not saying you got the word from him, but John Hart Ely in Democracy and Distrust, in his discussion of what he said were the three, what he called open-ended provisions of the Constitution that made a clause-bound interpretivism impossible or incomplete. He talked about the Privileges and Immunities Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and the Ninth Amendment. And he referred to these as delegations to future generations. I'm not saying you got it from him, but that is an idea.
I doubt that I did, but all the better. I mean, right. I'm not.
Right.
But here there is this difference.
Well, I'm not saying it's the same idea. I'm not saying you got it from him. I think there are differences, but
I like the idea. I like it in these terms. I was suggesting that this claim could be made even in an originalist public meaning way.
Got it.
And that's a more extreme comment. Ely's comment is in nature of a constitutional, what makes our constitutional practice best sense, and that's fine.
right. But he also characterized this as coming within what he was on his more expansive days tempted to call the ultimate interpretivism. So he too tried to bring it within what he called a broad and ultimate interpretivism. Were there any? Oh, Linda. Oh,
So Larry, you've probably addressed this in other work, and it's been a while since I looked at justice in plain clothes, so forgive me if I've missed something. But I was really interested in you talking about constitutional justice is avoiding singular injustice, because in the debates over gay rights, ever since Romer and the talk about singling out, right, a group, which comes from earlier equal protection cases, this theme of singling out has been very important. So I wonder if you see that as having particular doctrinal or clause hooks, or it's just a general precept.
I've only written about it once, and then, by the way, and that is, and not a piece you would likely have read, and that is, Chris Eisgerman and I wrote a piece about Israel and religious freedom, in which we asked the question, could Israel possibly honor its twin commitments to A, be a Jewish state, and B, be a state that respects the equal rights of all citizens? And there's almost a thought problem, but also a kind of report card for Israel, in which it didn't do so very well. But in any event, in passing there, because I've always thought this, and Chris wasn't sufficiently skeptical of it to refuse me the opportunity to stick it in. I say, political justice for these purposes is really about injustice. And in that way, I think it's a little bit like, the study of symmetry is about asymmetry. The study of chaos is about order. Do you know that? The science of chaos is about cases of order. The science of symmetry is about asymmetry. I think the study of justice is about injustice, and that's true even for Rawls, who's looking for really fundamental principles that people could agree on, not describing the ideally just state by any manner of means. So I think political justice, for a variety of reasons, is on the whole non-ideal, certainly in constitutional forms, and it's about stark injustices. And I don't know how to connect it to the singular treatment in Romer argument, but I do think that the case of gay rights, the case of women's rights, the case of the rights of African Americans are all instances not about making ourselves perfect, but just excising gross imperfections from who we are. And that's the interesting spirit of all this. And I think it actually, whether it's useful at all, it just happens to be what, among other things, it may be what is in the realm of feasible for a constitution to address, and appropriate, that it lop off these gross injustices as things on which the community should be able to agree. I'm not sure. But I only wrote about it in this chapter in a book on Israel.
Just when many years ago, your former colleague Peggy Davis wrote her book on family values and the Constitution, she talked a lot about how the understandings of freedom were in the wake of slavery. And I think that's a similar idea, that you don't understand the meaning of freedom unless you understand the state of unfreedom.
You don't miss your water till the wells run dry. That's for Ken. No, I think that's interesting and probably true, although I'm not sure it's the same as the point that I want to make. It is that what the Constitution in practice addresses in the name of justice are singular injustices.
I, too, was confused about what you said about avoiding injustice. Now, you can't mean, you don't mean, merely the government's avoiding the doing of injustice. You mean the government's acting to avoid injustice in society.
Of a dramatic sort, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, doing what
Right.
you can.
No,
doing
this,
what- yeah.
this is, I least of all want to distinguish between the things that government might owe people and the things it might be required to refrain from. And I don't see this as turning on that distinction.
But it's a positive obligation
It could well be a positive
to do what it
obligation.
can.
Doing, right, and indeed,
No.
as against gross injustice. So that, to go back to the Israeli case, I did not think I'd be discussing this article. Chris and I say that one of the things that's required for a nation to do this astonishing double act is an active posture of solicitous inclusion, which is doing all kinds of things. And the idea of solicitous inclusion was doing all manner of things to say that despite the fact that you are an announced Jewish state, that everyone enjoys equal membership. And we said the state had to really work hard to do that. And we said, but don't think Israel's in a special circumstance. We think what the United States owes the African American population is an active stance of solicitous inclusion of the same kind. So absolutely not. It's still the case that it's prominent injustices, like the circumstance of African Americans in America, that attract us in discussions of justice.
Emer, thank you so much.
I wanted to say something.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I wanted to say something. I was on the line, I think.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Of course, I love your text-practice relationship and how you put it on the text is in service of our practice, not in the other way around. You know, the text is in service of our practice. It does not. Our practice is not in service of. Sorry, I got it wrong. The text is in service of our practice. Our practice is not in service of the text. And it reminded me of Justinian, the Digest, when it comes to the non ex regula jus sumator sed ex jure quod est regula fiat, which means that it is not the rule that makes the law, it is the law that makes the rule. And I think that's still part of the relation. It's not the rule and the text. It is the law and the practice and the legal practice. Which, that's the parallel I see on that one. And I don't want to spoil the delegatory moment. It seems to be that's probably the only agreement we have today, but I have to disagree. I think still, well, of course, the vague and the ambiguous and the contradictory and the gap, those are the usually categories we use in that level. And then what comes to the one interpreting is discretion. And then you have to get it into a strong sense or a weak sense. And I would claim that Dworkin was always criticizing those that will jump into the strong sense of, oh, okay, I can take any 6 men or woman and let's get the most funny ones or the best looking ones, because he will still think that important mission, the best men, will be constraining, and then it will not be a strong sense of discretion and not a complete delegation or delegatory. It will still be room for trying to follow what you are told to do in that sense.
I think, by the way, it should be clear, I hope, that same thing is true of delegees, constitutional actor delegees. Namely, they are not at liberty to install any rule. They are at liberty to do the best they can to realize the general goal of free expression. So in that sense, I think they are in very much the same position, and exactly the same position with regard to what kind of discretion they have. They have an obligation to do the best job of this thing, and then the question is, how do they do that?
Okay, and then let me go to the fidelity. And now that you pointed also the faithfully thing, I think it's nice, and it's and Jim already pointed a little bit into this direction and I will be probably rephrasing now. So it seems to faithful to the past. That's not the idea we have in mind. That will probably sound more to the originalist. but it seems to be faithful to the future. That's probably the sense we have in mind as moral readers. So it's not the best it was, but the best it can be. So again, it is imperfect, but coping with that, we can try to best it can be, not the best that it is already imperfect. And that's the sense I take the title of the Fidelity to the Imperfect Constitution works really well and nicely. Thank you.
So, okay.
So I just wanted to say thank you for a wonderful day, and thank you for putting this together.
Jim, thank you for being the occasion of this for all of us. Thank you very much.